From a drug test failure due to a female fertility drug to his bizarre vindication involving chicken eggs? Here's why Conor Benn was cleared of all doping accusations. Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. were born bitter enemies. In October of last year, the stage was set for the next generation of the Benn-Eubank rivalry. A 157-pound catch-weight showdown reignited the British public's memories of two epic bouts between their fathers in the 1990s. But then it all came crashing down. Conor Benn failed his voluntary drug test, further polarizing an already divided boxing community. He tested positive for a banned substance called clomiphene. And if that substance sounds familiar, there's a good reason why. Do you recall hearing about a few superstars being popped for the same drug? John Jones was popped for clomiphene in 2016. And then a year later, Brock Lesnar tested positive for it as well. But what the heck is clomiphene? Clomiphene is more recognizable under its brand name, Clomid. It's an infertility drug prescribed mainly to women struggling to conceive. For women, it triggers their bodies to ovulate. But when taken by men, it can produce higher levels of natural testosterone. Bodybuilders have been using Clomid for decades as a way to mitigate the effects that estrogen has on the male body. In other words, it helps prevent man boobs. But doctors prescribe Clomid for male fertility issues as well, as it's shown to increase sperm production. But Benn was not the ideal candidate for such a prescription. He has absolutely no reason to take it for infertility reasons. He's 26 years old and already has a 2-year-old child. Clearly, he can put a bun in the oven. So that rules out any legitimate reason to be using Clomid. To be clear, even though I said Clomid has been shown to improve testosterone, it's not going to turn someone into the Hulk, and it isn't something you take to gain muscle, like say anabolic steroids for instance. With that said, clomiphene's still listed on the banned substance list, and still caused a major uproar. Nigel Benn, Conor Benn's father, vehemently supported his son, saying he's a faithful trainer and clean athlete. Well, of course Pops is going to support his son. It's one thing to get support from your immediate family, but what was the rest of the boxing world saying at the time? Chris Algieri, Benn's most recent opponent, says, "I had heard he wasn't a clean fighter. It's the most dangerous thing you could ever do." Heard he wasn't a clean fighter? That doesn't sound very reputable. Also, let's remember that Benn knocked Algieri out cold. Algieri sounds like a man searching for answers, making himself feel better for such a brutal loss. Tyson Fury had something to say about Benn as well. Chatting it up on a late-night talk show, the Gypsy King said, maybe he's trying for twins and doing IVF. Tyson Fury's the man, always the comedian. While some of Benn's peers took shots and Tyson Fury made us laugh, things took an even darker turn a few weeks after the first failed drug test, when it was revealed he failed multiple tests. Yikes! VADA, or the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, reported that Benn failed a urine analysis in September of last year, positive for trace amounts of clomiphene. Then, the World Boxing Council announced its findings in a separate test, positive for trace amounts of clomiphene. Benn had claimed his innocence all along, but that wasn't enough for the British Boxing Board of Control. They relinquished Benn's boxing license immediately upon receiving the results. No license, no boxing. That may seem a little harsh for a first-time offender, because two key words stood out in the findings that are deeply connected to Benn's innocence: trace amounts. These tests are measured on a scale much smaller than we're used to, like a microscopically tiny scale, and much more precise for that matter. By definition, a trace amount is seen as existing within the margin of error. In layman's terms, Benn's positive test could be attributed to contamination. There just isn't enough of the banned substance in the sample to say he's certainly a cheater. If the test came back with significant amounts of clomiphene, that'd be a whole other story entirely, and Benn would have to admit to his wrongdoings. But that's not the case here, people. The results showed trace amounts. We're talking fractions of a grain of sand. For some people, that argument is not good enough. Victor Conti, infamous former owner of Valco, the company at the center of the Major League Baseball steroid scandal, said, "An athlete is responsible for what is in his body, no matter how it got there." That seems a little unfair. especially coming from Mr. Conti, the man who orchestrated the most despicable doping scandal in the history of sports. There are times when things are out of our control, even if you are a superstar athlete. Just take Canelo Alvarez, for example. In 2018, Canelo was preparing for an epic rematch with Gennady Golovkin, and two familiar words were part of Canelo's controversy back then: trace amounts. But that time it wasn't clomiphene, it was clenbuterol. At the time, Canelo's camp had an odd explanation. They claimed the meat Canelo had been eating, for protein, was probably contaminated with the substance. Canelo spent a lot of time in Mexico training, and to be fair, Mexico isn't exactly known for its quality control. But it all sounded so ridiculous. Guess who had the last laugh? Meat lover Canelo Alvarez. It was scientifically proven that he was eating contaminated meat. All the bans and sanctions were lifted. So, Mr. Conti, Canelo's case is what's called precedent, a situation that established truth and serves as an example for future events. There are extraordinary cases to consider, and an athlete shouldn't be responsible for something he might have no control over. Just a few days ago, the World Boxing Council shared an update on Benn's status. They reversed their findings. Turns out they too believe that some things may be out of an athlete's control. Except for this time, it wasn't meat that was the culprit. It was eggs. The old failed drug test and egg dilemma. Which one came first? The World Boxing Council says the egg came first. Here's what they had to say. The WBC availed itself of the services of an expert nutritionist, and there was no conclusive evidence that Mr. Benn engaged in intentional or knowing ingestion of clomiphene. Wow, talk about ultimate vindication, but hold your hats. The next part is where things get wild. Mr. Benn's documented and highly elevated consumption of eggs raised a reasonable explanation for the adverse finding. Benn must have prayed to the patron saint of poultry. Do you hear that, Victor Conti? How do you like them drumsticks? Based on the WBC's findings, all of Benn's rankings are to be reinstated immediately. The WBC then added the cherry on top. They officially warned the World Anti-Doping Agency of the potential of false positives caused by ingestion of clomiphene-contaminated food. It's one thing to vindicate an athlete under your jurisdiction. It's another thing to warn an expert world organization. The WBC must be confident in their findings in order to say that. In recent years, boxing organizations wouldn't touch these investigations with a 10-foot pole. They usually let the doping agencies handle it. But here, the WBC is sticking its neck out for a fighter. Benn's name has been dragged through the mud for months, and this surely provided a sense of relief for the young man. It looks as if Britain and the world might finally get the Benn Eubanks fight they deserve. Let's hope these two do battle soon. And shall the better man prove once and for all which British family is superior? What a wild ride for boxing fans. So, from a drug test failure thanks to a female fertility drug, to his bizarre vindication involving chicken eggs, that's why Conor Benn was cleared of all doping accusations.